All right, the first key that you need to make sure you know, this quiz will be impossible without it, is you need to know your three trig functions. Whether you know those by SOHCAHTOA or whether you make up some kind of a story for it, like Oscar had a heap of apples or your own story, you need to know sine, cosine, and tangent and the fractions those represent. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. And however you're going to remember those, whether it's with SOHCAHTOA, but you have to know how to spell it, because if you spell it wrong, then it's wrong. That's the whole thing, is the spelling there. So SOHCAHTOA, or making up a story, make sure you know your three trig functions and the fractions that they give you. The standard form for writing a trig problem to solve is that you're going to do a trig name, then an angle equals a side over a side. Okay? That's the standard form no matter which trig function we do, no matter what we know. That's how we set it up. A trig name, sine, cosine, or tangent. An angle, whether it's a value that we know or whether it's a variable we want to find. And then equals a side divided by a side. And SOHCAHTOA tells you which sides you would use. There are going to be two main types of problems. The first type is where you will be solving for a side. So in this problem, I know a side, I know an angle, I want to know another side. So what we need to do is choose one angle on which to place our focus. You can never choose the 90, that won't work. Choose one of the other two angles, so we could choose the 20. Or we could find out that other angle is 70, because the triangle makes 180, and we could use the 70 if we wanted. I'll just go ahead and use the 20 that was given. Then we label the sides of the triangle according to the relationship with that angle. So what kind of a side is x? Opposite. What kind of a side is 5? Adjacent. Which trig function uses opposite and adjacent? Tangent. So you will need to select the appropriate trig function knowing which two sides we want to know or do know. Okay? So tangent uses opposite and adjacent. So again, the format is trig function. So choose your trig function. We chose tangent. Then an angle. The angle we're using is the 20 equals the fraction of the sides, which for tangent is opposite x over adjacent 5. To solve this, I'm going to multiply both sides by 5 and type that in the calculator. Now, if you've been using a cell phone as a calculator, that's totally fine on your homework. I'm not going to allow it on the test. I will have spare calculators here that you can use if you don't have a calculator of your own, or you could borrow one from a friend in another class or something like that. But you will not be allowed to use cell phone calculators during the test. So make sure that you know if you have been using one, we have to type things in differently. It's actually easier on a regular calculator. You just type it straight in. 5, tangent, 20, enter. Okay? So it's actually easier on a regular calculator to do it. So just type that in, and it would pop out the answer for us. Now, it is important that you show your work, because if I can see in this problem that you knew it was supposed to be tangent, but you set something else up wrong, at least I know you picked the right trig function. And if I can see you knew it was supposed to be 5 tangent 20, but somehow there's a wrong answer written down, then I know you must have hit a wrong button on the calculator. And so if I can tell what you're thinking and know where your mistake is, then you'll be able to get some of your points if you've done some stuff right and some stuff wrong. Okay? The second type of problem that you'll have is solving for an angle in a triangle. So in all of the pictures, we will always have a right triangle on the quiz. Even if the box isn't there, we're assuming everything's right, because that's the only way that we've learned to do trig is with right triangles. So you'll have a right triangle. You can either be solving for a side, like the first example, or solving for an angle, as in this one. So in solving for an angle, I'm going to place the focus on the angle that I'm looking for and label the sides according to that angle. So what kind of a side is the 3? And what kind of a side is the 7? So if I want to solve using opposite and hypotenuse, which one would I use? Sine. So you pick the trig function. So it's trig function, then angle. We don't know the angle, so we just use the x. Equals side over side. For sine, it's opposite over hypotenuse, 3 over 7. You don't need to do any algebra in solving this. We're not trying to get anything alone here. To find the x on the calculator, you need to do the second sign of the fraction. Second is when we're solving for an angle. Again, on a regular calculator, you just type that straight in. So if you've been using a phone calculator, you've been typing in it backwards, but on the quiz, you'll just type that straight in. Second sign, 3 divided 7, enter. Okay, and that'll give us our angle there. I want to go back to the first problem and say, what if instead I had placed my focus on the 70? What would have happened in solving it? It still works. You can choose the angle you want to focus on. So I would still be working with opposite and adjacent, so I would still be using tangent. But this time I would set up tangent of 70 equals, this time opposite would be 5, and adjacent would be x, if I'm focusing on the 70. So the reason why I'm going to look at this is how do we solve it when the x is in the bottom? It's a 2-step algebra problem instead of just the 1-step like it was when we focused on the other angle. So with a tangent, we could avoid that and just kind of rearrange it. Pick the other angle and it'll be easier. But with sine and cosine, you can't do that. Okay? If you're solving for the hypotenuse, that variable is going to be in the bottom. So you need to know how to do the algebra to solve this. So the first thing we do is multiply both sides by x. And then divide both sides by that tangent of 70. So then on the calculator, we would be doing 5 divided tangent 70. Okay. If you've been working on a cell phone calculator, you're typing this in backwards. And again, on a regular calculator, it's easier. You just type it right directly straight in. 5 divided tangent 70, enter. And it'll pop out the answer for you. Okay? And it'll be exactly the same answers if we had set it up the other way. So it doesn't matter which angle you choose, except for the 90. Don't choose the 90. But otherwise, the other two, you can choose either one and set it up. For tangent, sometimes one of them is easier than the other one. It was definitely easier to focus on the 20 in this problem. But for sine and cosine, sometimes they just get stuck, and you're going to end up having to have that letter in the bottom. So again, this is where showing work becomes a really pretty big deal, because then I can tell you knew which trig function you're supposed to use, you set it up right, but maybe something went wrong with the algebra, and that's not going to be the full deduction of all the points that the problem is worth. Okay? So you want to make sure that you show me what you're doing, so that if something goes wrong along the way, I can give you points for what you're doing right. Okay? All right, the last type of problem that you're going to have is a word problem. So that was like what was in section 7. So we just want to kind of focus on some of the main vocabulary that we would see in those problems. I would start by drawing a right triangle, because you're going to end up with a right triangle. That's what we're doing with trig, is working with right triangles. Then we're going to have to fill in some information as we read through the problem. So some keywords that we've seen in our problems. We've seen the word altitude. So if I'm told what the altitude of this triangle is, where would I label that in this? Where wouldn't altitude belong? What's another word for altitude? Height. So where's the height in this picture? The one that's straight up. The one that's straight up and down. Okay? So if you are told an altitude or a height, that is where it belongs. Okay? If you're told an altitude or a height, that's where it belongs, because an altitude or a height is something that is measured straight up and down. Okay? Other words that we have commonly seen in our problems, we've seen ground distance, which would be like along the ground, mentioning that we're measuring out that distance there. So if you're told a ground distance, that's where we would place that value. Another word we've seen show up in problems is shadow. Where would a shadow be?
On the ground.
On the ground. A shadow is something that we see on the ground. So a shadow length would go on the ground. Okay? You can't see a shadow in midair. A shadow is something you see on the ground. So that's where the shadow would be. Okay? A lot of students want to label a shadow on the hypotenuse. A hypotenuse is actually rarely used in these word problems because it's a length that's not typically an easy thing to measure. We usually care about how far away something is or how high something is. The times we have used that hypotenuse, there was a problem in your assignment where you were working with a kite, and that hypotenuse would be the measurement of the length of the string then. Okay? So that would be a time where we could use the hypotenuse to be like a kite string. If the kite's flying up in the air, then that hypotenuse would be the kite string. Another example would be maybe like a cable, a support cable. So sometimes like a telephone pole would have a support cable, and that could be referencing the support cable. Otherwise, the hypotenuse is actually a pretty rare thing in these word problems. So then the other thing is the angle. There were two ways that an angle can be given to you. You can be given an angle of elevation or an angle of depression. And you can be given an angle of elevation or an angle of depression. An angle of elevation is if you're standing on the ground and looking up to something, how far are you looking up? So that's that bottom angle. An angle of depression is if I was on top of the telephone pole, how far would I need to look down from there? An angle of depression will be outside of your triangle, so it will not be helpful to you. But what is true about an angle of depression and an angle of elevation? They're always the same. Why? Alternate interior angles. So because those two are alternate interior angles and we're assuming the horizon is parallel to the ground, they will always be the same. So whether the problem says the word elevation or depression doesn't really matter in the end. They both go in the same place. They both go in that lower corner angle. A lot of students want to put a depression as the top angle inside the triangle. That's not correct. Okay? Whether it says depression or whether it says elevation, it is that lower corner angle. They both end up in the same place. Okay? And then once you would have your stuff labeled, depending on which information you were given and wanted to find, then it turns exactly into our first two types of problems. So it just has that extra step of drawing and labeling your picture. Questions?
What if you're like given two angles in the triangle? Like which one do you choose?
Whichever one you want.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Yep, never choose the 90, but if you know both of the other two angles, just pick whichever one you want.